Whether or not you agree with my assertion in the previous video that NCAA 13's recruiting might have been better than NCAA 14's, I hope that I've at least made a compelling case that NCAA 14's recruiting system left a lot of room for Tiburon to improve in its upcoming EA Sports college football game in 2023 or 2024 or whenever the heck it actually releases. So I want to spend this video providing constructive feedback and pitching some ideas I have for how I think Tiburon could improve the recruiting mechanic going forward by hopefully taking the best of what both NCAA 13 and 14 had to offer. That previous video included a lot of criticism of NCAA 14, so I want to start off this second part by acknowledging features in NCAA 14 that I feel are strict upgrades over 13, and which I would like to see definitely be preserved in EA's future college football games. I think my single favorite upgrade in NCAA 14 is the idea of having complementary and competitive campus visits. If you schedule players from complementary positions to visit campus on the same week, you'll get bonus points. For example, bringing in a running back along with the lineman who will be blocking for him will provide bonus points to all of those players. But you also have to be wary of scheduling multiple players of the same position. If you schedule 2 or 3 running backs on the same week, they'll meet each other and see each other as competition, and some or all of them will lose interest out of the fear that your backfield will be overcrowded, and they'll lose out on playing time to other backs from that same recruiting class. This is one of the few elements of NCAA 14's recruiting design which I do feel retains that more humanistic, character-driven ethos from NCAA 13, and I like it a lot. NCAA 14 also makes it much more clear exactly how your performance on the field will impact the interest level of the visiting prospects. In NCAA 13, I was never clear about whether scheduling a visit during a bye week would make a difference, or if it mattered whether or not I actually win the game if I played one that week. I always assumed that the prospect was there to watch the football game, so scheduling a visit during a bye week would presumably impose a penalty, and I also always assumed that winning the game improved the prospect's interest, and also I assumed that the prospect would also be more interested if the players at his position performed well during that game. But the UI for NCAA 13 was never clear about whether any of that was actually the way that the game worked, or if the prospect only cared about the 3 recruiting pitches that I try to sell him on during the visit. NCAA 14 makes all of this blatantly clear when you schedule the visit by showing exactly how many points the prospect will earn if certain criteria are met. It would be nice if some of this stuff were on a sliding scale, like if a running back prospects want me to rush for 150 yards, but I end up with 148. I should still get something for having come close to meeting his expectation, but, that's a minor nitpick. EA Sports College Football won't necessarily have to commit to using either NCAA 13's recruiting paradigm or NCAA 14's paradigm. It could come up with something completely new. Hopefully it's something that is at least as good. But if they do look to replicate what the past games did well, perhaps there is some happy middle ground between the recruiting paradigms of 13 and 14. Something that maintains some of the efficiencies of NCAA 14, but without having to sacrifice that humanity and depth that I loved from NCAA 13. In fact, going back and playing NCAA 13 in order to do this research for this video reminded me of my biggest complaint with the in-season recruiting, which isn't the tediousness of the actual mechanics, it's how slow and sluggish all of the menus are. Even for someone enjoying the recruiting process, dealing with several seconds of loading between every menu, frequent lag in input recognition, and the occasional dropped input altogether is still an extreme test of the user's patience. I'm not so worried about slow menus for the upcoming games because the solid-state hard drives included in both PlayStation and Xbox consoles should keep loading times to a bare minimum. The fact that NCAA 13 stopped to autosave every time you exit back out to the main recruiting menu certainly didn't help, And for any player going back to play NCAA 13 or 14 for that matter, I highly recommend turning the autosave off when playing Dynasty and just do it manually after you're done with all your recruiting. There was also a lot of unnecessary user input. For example, why do we need to select a recruiting pitch and go to a separate menu that usually only has 2, maybe 3 options, which are make a pitch, find a pitch, or sway the pitch? Why not just map each of those options to a separate button on the controller? Press X to make the pitch, press square to find the prospect's pitch interest, or to attempt to sway the interest level once it has been discovered, or press triangle to compare the pitch against another competing school. NCAA 14 also had some minor UI issues that could be cleaned up. Maybe use the higher resolution to put more information on a single screen in order to reduce the number of tabs that the user has to navigate between. So, streamlining menus is a no-brainer for improving the user experience. But let's talk about how we could potentially create a hybrid mechanical design that hopefully combines both NCAA 13 and 14 into the best of both worlds. Maybe the first time you call a prospect, you have to have a get-to-know-you conversation through an interface similar to NCAA 13. Then, subsequent recruiting efforts for that prospect could be handled by the more abstract point allocations similar to NCAA 14. This way, you at least get a personal introduction with each prospect, so that the user is forced to learn a little bit about him and see the recruit as more of a character. An alternative, more complicated approach, but one that would introduce more strategy, would be for EA Sports College Football to separate recruiting hour allocations for the head coach, which is you the player, compared to the coordinators and assistant coaches. Maybe the team has 15 recruiting hours total for the week, but the head coach only gets 5 of those hours, and the remaining 10 are split between the offensive and defensive coordinator. Or maybe there's 12 hours total and 3 hours are given to the head coach and then another 3 to the offensive, defensive, and maybe also a special teams coordinator. Calls from the head coach in this model would be personally handled by the user via an interface more similar, but hopefully more streamlined, than NCAA 13. Prospects should be more receptive to calls from the head coach and get more points from successful pitches. This would create a degree of strategy in which the user would want to personally contact your highest priority prospects, or the ones getting the most competing attention from other schools. But the hours available to the head coach would be much more limited. You would have to balance out your available hours against how much you prioritize each respective prospect. Calls from the assistant coaches would then be handled automatically via a system more like NCAA 14. The assistant coaches would give you a summary at the start of each new week that outlines the results of last week's automated recruiting efforts. This report would include changes in prospects' interest levels and discovering any recruits that match up well with your school's traits. And if the Dynasty mode allows users to play as offensive, defensive, or special teams coordinators, then the user's manual recruiting hours could come out of that coordinator's recruiting hours, while the head coach's recruiting hours would then be automated. And the user would only be able to recruit offensive players if they are the offensive coordinator, defensive players if they are the defensive coordinator, and maybe specialists such as kickers, punters, long snappers, and generic athletes if they are the special teams coordinator. In fact, Maximum Football implemented a similar idea by allowing the user to choose to delegate any given call to an assistant coach. This would generally generate less interest from the prospect, but it would save you, the player, some time, and it could be useful for instances in which your school is maybe the top choice of a prospect, and you're just trying to check in order to maintain that status. Either of these methods would ensure that the user is personally engaging with the recruiting system and with the prospects within it. It would also reduce some of the tedious interactions and would maintain some of the more streamlined efficiencies from the NCAA 14 model. Regardless of which idea is preferred, head coaches should still be the only ones who can offer scholarships or make promises. That way, these key steps of the recruiting process must be done personally by the user. When you think your assistant coaches have learned all there is to know about a prospect, it's time to move him into your head coach's call queue so that you can personally interview him and make those promises and scholarship offers in person. If recruiting promises do come back in future EA Sports college football titles, then I hope that they are at least a little bit better explained than they were in NCAA Football 13. Just like how NCAA 14 did a better job of explaining where the points come from for on-campus visits, I would like to see more detailed explanations of how much breaking a promise affects your coach's reputation, and also more detailed explanations of how specific promises are met or broken. For example, there's all the promises that refer to a prospect's first year on campus. If they redshirt their freshman year, does that count as the first year on campus? Or does it only refer to their first non-redshirt year? So if I promise that I won't recruit another prospect of the same position in the player's first year, and I redshirt the player during his freshman year, am I allowed to recruit another player at that position that year? Another point of confusion is if position groups that are separate on the depth chart, like offensive linemen and linebackers, are considered the same position for the purposes of these promises. So, if I promise a left outside linebacker not to recruit another player at the same position, can I still recruit a right outside linebacker? It sure looks like all outside linebackers are the same position in the prospect list, but the promises list splits them up by left and right outside linebackers. So are those both considered to be the same outside linebacker position or not? And if I promise not to recruit a player at that position before his first year, then does that apply to the same recruiting class in which I recruited the prospect to whom I made the promise? Or does it also apply if they redshirt their freshman year, because then it's not their first year on campus yet? And does that apply retroactively to prospects in the same position who already committed before I made the promise? And if I promise solid playing time first year on campus, and then redshirt the player his freshman year, do I auto-fail that promise? Or will it apply to his second year, in which he wouldn't be redshirted and would be a redshirt freshman? And so on and so on. Case in point, how does this true sophomore still have a pending won't recruit another player at same position first year on campus promise? How is that even possible? And speaking of the solid playing time first year on campus promise, how much playing time constitutes solid playing time? Is there a specific number of snaps that he needs to play over the course of the entire season? Does he need to have a certain number of snaps in every single game? If he misses most of the season with an injury, does that count as me breaking the promise, even though that's something that's completely out of my control? Then there's the play a game in the prospect's home state promise, which doesn't bother to tell the user that the game in the prospect's home state actually has to be played during the prospect's first year on the team. Nor does it bother to mention that the prospect actually has to play at least one down in that game, so he can't be a redshirt. That would have been a really nice thing to know before. When I was playing my UNLV dynasties, whenever I would recruit prospects from California or Utah or Colorado, I would always make this game in the home state promise because I knew that I would be playing a game at San Diego State, at Utah State, or at Colorado State at least once every other season. During a prospect's 4 or 5 year career with the team, he'd be guaranteed to play in at least 2 games in all of those states. But after failing that promise, I learned from trial and error that this promise apparently only applies to the prospect's first year. So I've got to check which games are going to be home games and which in-conference games are going to be away games before I make this promise. And then this also begs the question, are there any other promises that don't specifically say first year on campus, but which actually mean first year on campus? Like, does this apply to promising good national exposure, or to winning a conference championship, or a national championship for that matter? Do I have to do these things while the prospect is a freshman? What about cutting players to whom you've made promises? Does that hurt your coach's integrity? Or can you just cut them and then the promise is voided as if it's never been made? Because that seems like a kind of unfair way to be able to just cancel out promises that you're not going to be able to fulfill. It would be really nice to know these things before making these promises, especially considering that going through the process of testing them through trial and error would require playing through multiple recruiting seasons, which is a ridiculously large time investment, just for the purpose of testing. So yeah, if this feature comes back, EA, please provide better explanations of how all these promises actually work. Another problem with NCAA Football 13 and 14 is that even though the recruiting prospects are imbued with a degree of character and humanity, that character and humanity does not persist through their time as actual players. When recruits sign with the school, most of that character is stripped away by the game, and the players are reduced to just a name and an age attached to a collection of attribute ratings. Aside from any promises that you made to the prospects, all of those wants and goals and dreams that you talked with them about in your virtual phone calls kind of drop away and disappear. Failing to fulfill your promises on them might cause them to seek a transfer to another school, but that's about the only aspect of their character that is retained once they join your roster. And even then, the promises don't even take into account how valuable the associated recruiting pitch was to them. I don't even think the game remembers what the players' original recruiting priorities were. The end result is that you spend all this time, especially in NCAA 13, talking to these prospects during the recruiting process and filling in personalities for them in your mind, only for them to turn into mindless automatons when they actually join your team. It's certainly not a deal breaker for the game. NCAA football never pitched itself as an RPG or social simulation. It's supposed to be a simulation of the sport of college football. Social simulation between the coaches and players is admittedly a bit outside of the scope of the game, but it still put all this effort into humanizing these characters when they are prospects, so it's a shame that humanization does not carry over to their time as actual players. People say that imitation is the highest form of flattery, and NCAA Football 13 has definitely been imitated. The indie football game Maximum Football 2020, developed by Canuck Games, included a college dynasty mode that is largely inspired by NCAA Football 13. It lacks the polish and production value of EA's big-budget product, being that it was developed by one guy on a shoestring budget. It also lacks a lot of that humanity that made NCAA Football 13's in-season recruiting work so well. Maximum Football's recruiting process feels very robotic, and there's never really any illusion of the prospects being people. But Maximum Football did add one subtle little thing that I really like, which injects a little bit of humanity back into the game. In Maximum Football, each prospect has a little biographical factoid. As far as I can tell, it's entirely superficial fluff text, but it does mean that the prospects are more than just a name along with the 40-yard dash time and bench press reps. For example, Benjamin West here isn't just the 213th ranked running back prospect with the 4.4 40-yard dash time. He's also that kid from Florida who's really into science fiction. This is a brilliant seed of an idea from David Winter, the owner and lead designer at Canuck Play, the company that developed Maximum Football. Sadly, the Maximum Football series was canceled and the IP was sold to Modus Games. It's unclear if the College Dynasty mode will return in Modus's version of Maximum Football, and so it's unclear if Modus will be iterating on this particular idea. Stuff like this is the reason why I recommend that people play and support indie games like Maximum Football and Axis Football and now Legend Bowl. Even though the gameplay and graphics of those games might be rough around the edges and not all that great, there's still these little ideas like this that have the potential to inspire true innovation within the genre. But if these games get no exposure at all and nobody plays them, then nobody is going to notice stuff like this, let alone suggest that other developers like EA or 2K look at these games for inspiration. I can only hope that EA noticed this neat addition and that it serves as inspiration for its upcoming college football game. Hey, they basically copied Axis Football's homework for Madden 22's franchise mode, and they're copying the QB charge meter from Legend Bowl, so it's well within the realm of possibility that EA might copy Maximum Football's homework for their college game. At the very least, it would be nice to see these biographical tidbits remain on the player's profile after he joins a team's roster. This sort of biographical fluff text could be expanded to have actual gameplay relevance. For one thing, the game could potentially keep a database of secret personality traits for each prospect, and then use those traits to customize the flavor text dialogue that comes from the prospect. This way, the prospect's responses to the user's pitches or questions will feel more personal and much less arbitrary and random. Better yet, certain biographical information could potentially be used to provide the recruiting school with information about so-called intangibles. Even a line or two of biographical text could give the recruiter clues as to how smart the player is, how he performs under pressure, whether he can improvise if a play breaks down, how high his ceiling is for skill progression, or other gauges of talent that aren't necessarily captured by 40-yard dash times, shuttle times, and bench press reps. For example, Minka Capers here looks like he's going to be a pretty smart kid who will probably keep his grades up and maintain academic eligibility. Marquise Ronig here, on the other hand, maybe not so much. It could also provide clues about the player's personal priorities. Is he likely to stick with the school for the entire 4 or 5 years to graduate, or will he enter the pro draft early if he has an opportunity? Will he be content to redshirt? Will he be willing to play a different position if the school's depth chart at his position is already loaded? Will he be a locker room leader or a distraction? How strongly will his morale be affected by limited playtime, poor performance, or losing games? Will he keep his grades up and maintain academic eligibility? And the list goes on and on. There's a lot of potential here. For example, if a prospect was an honor student in high school, then I can probably assume that he'll keep up his academic eligibility in college and might also be a very smart player on the field. Inversely, if a student was suspended in high school for, say, drug use, maybe I should have legitimate concern that he won't maintain academic eligibility and won't be able to play for part of the year. Maybe he graduated early from high school, which might imply that he will also declare for the pro draft early if he has that opportunity. Maybe he went to the hospital multiple times for broken bones as a child, and so that might be a red flag that indicates he's prone to injury. Maybe the prospect loves camping and hiking during the summer, and so he's going to be happier and perform better at a school that is a short drive from a national park and maybe not one that's in the middle of a huge urban city. Maybe a prospect is a big partier, and a coach at a religious school like Notre Dame or BYU might have to be concerned about whether that athlete will fit in with the school's culture. By making a few changes to the way that recruiting works and injecting a little bit more personality into the individual prospects, and also by making those personality attributes persist beyond the end of recruiting, perhaps EA Sports College Football can be less about brute forcing prospects to commit in order to fill roster spots, and a little bit more about finding players who fit the culture of the school and team. This sort of thing could help maintain the illusion that the players on your roster are actual characters, that they are actual people with personalities. We're going to be playing these games on more powerful hardware, so the technical capabilities for what they can do should be greater than what we saw 2 generations ago, because remember, that's how long ago the last NCAA football game was. It was on the PlayStation 3 and on the Xbox 360. We've had one entire console generation that did not see one of these games, so we've had 2 leaps in technology in the intermediate time. And while we're on the topic of talking about suggestions for future college football games, let me hop onto my SJW bandwagon and say that I'd really like to see EA Sports College Football include women as players and as coaches. Maybe also a female referee model as well. I've pitched this idea for Madden and also for the indie football games, especially for the new The Yard gameplay mode in Madden, which is supposed to be backyard football with a user-created avatar, in which there is absolutely no excuse to not have playable female avatars. Unlike the idea of a woman playing in the NFL, the idea of women playing in Division I college football isn't even a hypothetical. It's reality. It has been for a while. Even back before its cancellation in 2013, there were women playing in Division I college football. In 2020, we saw a struggling Vanderbilt kicking squad depleted by COVID protocols recruit Sarah Fuller from Vandy's soccer pitch onto the gridiron in order to act as an interim kicker. She kicked 2 successful extra points, making her the first woman to play and score for a Power 5 team. But she wasn't the first woman to suit up for a Division I school, or even the first to score points. Katie Nida, I think that's how you pronounce her name, kicked for the New Mexico Lobos in the early 2000s and converted 2 extra points in a 2003 game, making her the first woman to score points in any Division I FBS college football game. A few weeks later, Tanya Butler became the first woman to score a field goal in the NCAA with the Division II West Alabama Tigers. But women's on-field contributions go back still further. Ashley Martin converted 3 extra points for the Jacksonville State Gamecocks in 2001, making her the first woman to score points in a Division I FCS football game. She was further preceded by Liz Heaston, who scored 2 extra points for the Willamette Bearcats in NAIA football in 1997, making her the first woman to ever play and score in any college football game ever. Her number 39 jersey is currently on display in the College Football Hall of Fame in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, place kickers are football players too, and women playing in college football is almost as old as EA's college football game series itself, going back to when the game was still called Bill Walsh College Football. And women aren't just kickers either. Toni Harris made news a couple years ago when Seahawks coach Pete Carroll congratulated her for signing with Central Methodist University to play safety, making her the first woman to receive a full scholarship to play college football in a skill position. More will surely follow in her lead. Women are also coaching in Division I college football. Heather Marini was promoted to quarterbacks coach for Brown University in 2020, breaking the glass ceiling for position coaches in Division I football. There's also several high-profile examples of women coaching in the NFL. Katie Sowers was an assistant coach for the 49ers before moving to the Chiefs, and she has now coached in 2 Super Bowls. She also happened to be the first out lesbian coach in the NFL. She isn't the only woman coaching in the NFL either. There's also Lori Locust, an active assistant defensive line coach for the Super Bowl champion Buccaneers. And then there's Jennifer King, the first black woman to be hired as an NFL coach, who is currently the assistant running backs coach for the Washington Commanders football team. And the list is growing every year. If I'm going to be able to put a virtual version of myself in my favorite team's uniform or coach's polo in EA Sports College Football, then I see absolutely no reason why my daughter should not be able to do the same if she wishes. I also see absolutely no reason why women shouldn't show up here and there as possible prospects in EA Sports College Football's recruiting feature. Heck, by the time the game actually comes out, there might already be a woman on a team's active roster.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
Women are in the game, EA, so put them in the game. Before I go, I want to reiterate my hope that EA's upcoming EA Sports College Football video game will successfully tap into the humanity and character of NCAA 13 and avoid the more clerical and dehumanizing approach that NCAA Football 14 took. And also that it's, a bit more gender inclusive. I also want to share my own personal fears for how EA might very well go about dehumanizing its player base in this upcoming football game. I feel like the overall quality of EA Sports College Football will basically come down to what EA's own true motivations are for creating the game. EA could have continued to make college football games after NCAA Football 14, just without accurate rosters or the ability to share accurate named rosters. I could be wrong, but as far as I know, nothing in the lawsuits actually prevented EA from making more college football games, as long as they avoided the use of any collegiate athlete's likeness or name, including things like jersey numbers and height and weights and stuff like that, that would make them personally identifiable. EA also started licensing the rights to use college football teams for Madden 18's Long Shot Story Mode. In 2017, Madden showed that EA was perfectly capable and willing to individually license colleges for use in a sports game. So why didn't they make a standalone college football game then? Even if it only would have included a couple dozen teams from the Power 5 conferences. Why not? Why did EA sit on its college football franchise for 10 years and then finally now decided it's time to start making the game again? Consumer demand was always there. They always had the legal ability to license schools without an NCAA license or player likenesses, and they sure as heck always had the money for it. So what changed recently? Why is this game coming out now instead of back in 2015 or 2017? Well, I think the reason is that the courts have recently decided that the NCAA and colleges cannot deny athletes the right to profit from their name and likenesses. These college athletes now have the legal right to sign endorsement and merchandise deals. It wasn't long after this announcement that EA finally announced its long-awaited new college football game. This brings me to the big, fat, ugly elephant in the room. Microtransaction-fueled, pay-to-win, competitive Ultimate Team game modes. What EA has now that they didn't have in 2015 or 2017 is the legal clearance to get the name and likeness of college athletes for use in Ultimate Team. I firmly believe that EA is making this game because they want to sell virtual trading cards with pictures of college football stars on them. Nothing more, nothing less. And if you don't think they'll do it, I would like to remind you that NCAA Football 14 did have an Ultimate Team mode. I personally never played it, and the servers I think have been offline for a while now, so I can't go and play it now to tell you how it is or how it was. I believe that since EA did not have the rights to current player likenesses, they had to populate the Ultimate Team card packs with historic graduated college players, most or all of which were already in Madden, and so EA had the rights to their likenesses. Also, EA has basically already confirmed that microtransactions and Ultimate Team, or at least something very similar, will be in EA Sports College Football. So I'm not even guessing here. They've said it will be there. Personally, I believe that EA is not bringing back college football video games because of consumer demand, or because of the popularity of college football, or because of any desire to make a better football game than Madden. I firmly believe that the only reason that EA Sports College Football exists or is going to exist is to serve as a vehicle for some version of Ultimate Team. And that has me very worried that the pay-to-win online game mode will get the brunt of the resources, while any sim-style Dynasty mode will feel like little more than an afterthought, the same way that Madden's franchise mode has felt for years. If we're lucky, EA will also want a strong single-player Dynasty experience to try to attract fans of the old games and keep them playing long enough to maybe get some of them addicted to Ultimate Team, at least for the first year or two anyway. After that, they will probably be able, and surely perfectly willing, to coast on the bare minimum effort for Dynasty. We just have to hope that the Dynasty mode is already really good before EA loses interest and stops supporting it and expanding it. I don't want to leave on a total downer. So despite my cynical certainty that Ultimate Team is the motivation for making this college football game in the first place, I am still fairly confident that there will be enough pressure on EA to make a decently compelling Dynasty mode in order to get good reviews, positive customer reception, and as little controversy as possible. They don't want a repeat of the Star Wars Battlefront 2 fiasco. releasing a college football game that is seen by the public as a shameless cash grab, or worse yet, seen as trying to sell unregulated gambling to children, would bring the ultimate teams of FIFA and Madden into the critical spotlight as well, even more so than with the loot boxes of Battlefront 2, because there will be a much more direct connection between each game's Ultimate Team modes. Even though selling unregulated gambling to children is exactly what EA is doing with Ultimate Team, and these games should have an adults-only rating for that reason alone, the general public doesn't seem to see Ultimate Team as anything more nefarious than buying packs of trading cards, and it is in EA's best interest to make this game look as innocent and wholesome as is possible. EA will also have been developing this game for at least 2 years by the time it releases, and it will have the benefit of being able to be built on the engine or codebase of Madden, for better or for worse, which means that it likely won't feel like a half-finished rush job that was slapped together in a few months, the way that some of Madden's franchise upgrades have felt. So I am cautiously optimistic that EA Sports College Football will be good. And if EA and Tiburon were able to identify the same strengths and weaknesses of NCAA 13 and 14 that I did, and make a game that takes the best ideas of both while minimizing the problems with either, then it's very possible that we could be looking at a sports gaming instant classic. A Dynasty mode that is deep, robust, and rewarding, but also one that is full of character and of humanity. Thanks for watching.